So we've been talking about a better story. 2 weeks ago, we started in this Advent season talking about how if we slow down enough and if we stop and reflect that most of us can be aware of deep within us some sort of longing for a better story. Whether for ourselves, for someone else we care about, for mankind in general, that we look at some of the chapters in the stories that we see and we see so much pain and so much hurt and so much brokenness. And we look at the world around us and we see so much hatred and violence and we say there's got to be a better story than this. And we long for something better, at the very least a better ending to this story that somehow will redeem all of the pain and the turmoil in this world. Well, that was kind of a depressing Sunday, so a couple people told me. Last Sunday, there was the beginning of some good news because we talked about the fact that there is a better story and that God has extended an invitation to us to become part of His bigger, better story than simply what we see in the world around us or what we may recognize in our own lives. And we talked some about the invitations given to Elizabeth and Zechariah, the invitations to Mary and subsequently to Joseph, to the shepherds, to the Magi, each one inviting to play a part in a bigger story. Part of the lesson of that is you're not too old, ask Zechariah and Elizabeth, or too young, ask Mary, or too poor and insignificant, ask the shepherds, or too important and rich, ask the Magi. No, there's a place for all of us to enter that story and to have a part. You say, well, okay, sign me up. But now what? What does that mean to be part of that story? What does it look like to be part of that better story? I would imagine if we were honest, we could ask and say, how many of us would like to change something in our own story if we could go back and do it? How many of us would like to change, if we could, something that's happened to us? Or maybe something that we ourselves have done. Some circumstance. Maybe it's, we wish we were taller, or not so tall, or that seems silly by comparison with some of the things that we would rewrite if we could. But when we think about where we are right here and now, and we think about, I want a better story. The change in our story that we often are thinking about has something to do with the path that we're on. It's something to do with maybe our position in life or the degree of pleasure or enjoyment that we experience, or maybe our possessions. Sometimes when we accept God's invitation into His story, sometimes all those things happen. Sometimes our path does change and our position changes and our possessions change. Just ask Richard Stearns, I think it is. Do you know who he is? He wrote a book called The Hole in Our Gospel. Richard Stearns was CEO of Lennox Incorporated. Richard Stearns was in the midst of a lucrative business career when God invited him into His story. His path changed, his position changed. I'm sure his possessions changed as he gave all that up and became the CEO of World Vision US. He's not getting the income he got before. There's things he can't buy now that he could buy before. He's on a different path. His position has changed. In the eyes of the world, the CEO of a big Fortune 500 company and now the CEO of an organization that's trying to feed the world, not one that's trying to make money. That's a change in position, isn't it? You heard the expression, be careful what you wish for? But that's not really what I'm talking about this morning. What I'm talking about is what God offers us at its heart. And I think at some level what we really want is so much more than a change in our circumstances. What God offers us, first and foremost, what living the better story involves is, first of all, a change in our perspective. That sounds like socks or underwear and the Christmas present under the tree. Oh, it's so much better than that. A change in our perspective. That perspective starts with a perspective on our past and even our present. One member of our church family 2 weeks ago left the service and said, well, you know what the solution is, don't you? This longing for a better story? And quoted the words of a familiar song, shackled by a heavy burden, 'neath a load of guilt and shame. That may describe some of us in terms of our longing for a better story. But the song doesn't end there. It says, then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I am no longer the same. Well, what changed? Part of what changed is my perspective, because God has offered forgiveness, He's offered pardon, and He's offered peace. And when we know that the failures that we have, the things we've messed up and the failures in our life and all of the guilt and shame, when we know that that is forgiven and pardoned, that changes something in our story, doesn't it? And when we know that God can work within us and place a peace in our hearts, that's a change in perspective too, isn't it? So let me just tell you right off. Door number one, you can have your change in pathway. You can have your change in possessions. You can have your change in position. And keep your guilt and shame. Door number two, keep your current path. Keep your possessions. Keep your position. But have God's pardon and peace. Which are you going to choose? But that's not all. There's so much more behind door number two. Even in terms of our perspective. Not only does our perspective change in terms of our failures and in terms of the guilt and shame that we so often carry, our perspective on our own pain and the pain of others changes. Think about the biblical characters we looked at last week who were invited into God's big story. The story, especially the part of that story that we celebrate at Christmas, and we say, well, that's fine for them. Boy, everybody knows who they are. They're famous. Boy, they had important roles in the story. Yeah, it must be nice. That's easy. Well, now, wait a minute. And they said yes. They didn't know all that they were saying yes to. They probably didn't know the half of it. Them saying yes and their part in the story, they were not without hardship and sacrifice and risk. Zechariah himself, an old man, unable to speak for 9 months because he questioned the message when it came to him that he and his wife were going to have a baby. After that, being a dad when he should have been a great-grandpa. I mean, I said something about Marilla this morning about kind of speaking for her about, wow, isn't this great, being independently mobile? And Bruce says, yeah, for her. And Bruce is young. And he gets a little tired chasing after a little one. What do you think about Zechariah? And then, of course, there's Elizabeth, being pregnant at her age, birthing a child, raising him. Things we don't think about. And then for both of them, I'm not sure exactly when they died, but likely long before they had a chance to see their son live out his part in the story. Don't be too quick to assume that someone else's path is easy. Of course, Mary, bearing ridicule and shame from those who did not understand or who would not believe her story, enduring the pregnancy, the travel to Bethlehem, giving birth in a barn, fleeing to Egypt for the safety of herself and her child and her husband. We know those things as part of the story, but they were real life. Joseph would say all the same things, minus the pregnancy, the birth. Choosing to believe the angel and to take Mary as his wife. That was a hard decision, but oh so critical to the story. It's not just what happens to us, it's how we choose to embrace and accept the path that's offered to us. He too shared in the ridicule and the shame. He bore the burden of providing safety for his wife and this child that was going to be born before, during, and after the birth. The shepherds, maybe joining the story wasn't so hard for them. Their life was simply hard, period. Now they abandoned their flocks, risked the loss of their meager jobs. Maybe that's not such a big deal. Their lives didn't really change afterwards as far as we knew. I mean, not the path, not the possessions, not those other things. They went back, as far as we know, to the same jobs. But what changed? Their perspective changed. They were filled with joy that wasn't dependent upon door number one. And they didn't even understand all that was behind door number two, but they were transformed. They were changed. Their perspective was different. And they spread all over the countryside what they'd seen. The Magi, well, yeah, they're rich. They didn't have any troubles, but, they could have chosen otherwise. But months of travel across the desert. Yeah, maybe they lived in a little more luxury than someone else making that same journey, but it wasn't like living in the comforts of home. Their call to be part of that story also involved risk and sacrifice and discomfort. We need to realize that we're not the only ones who struggle. And to be able to have that perspective changed and have our eyes and hearts opened that there's a lot of pain in the world. And we can come to church on a Sunday morning and we can sit here and we can feel our own struggles and we can look around and everyone else looks like everything's fine. Until maybe we start opening our hearts and sharing a little bit. Don't assume. Chances are that anybody you meet in church has some heavy burden at least that they're carrying. And if it's true in church, how much more true is it in the world around us? But we're not done yet. It's not just about a change in our perspective that changes our attitude towards our past and our failures and that gives us peace in the present. It's not just a change in our perspective that changes our attitude towards our own pain in relation to the pain of others. There's a change in our perspective that recognizes that my life can be connected to God's story in ways that matter. And I shared last week that little, I don't even know what to call it, that little poem of sorts about the nail. That for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, and for want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the war was lost. All for the want of a horseshoe nail. And someone left here last Sunday and commented on the way out something to the effect of, I just want to be a nail that makes a difference. And we can be when we're connected to God's story. And oh, how that perspective can change everything. our circumstances don't have to change. As long as we have the hope, as long as we have the confidence that somehow my story is connected with a bigger story, and it will make sense. It will contribute in some way that we may not be able to see or understand. You know, our sisters and brothers in Nigeria, you know, a big part of what has gotten them through their struggles and all their suffering and their pain is the confidence that they, the church in Nigeria, are part of the big story of the church throughout all the ages, which is part of God's bigger redemptive story. And that there's not one drop of blood that has been shed by the church in Nigeria. There's not one bit of suffering, not one loss of property. There's not one bit of pain that has been experienced by the thousands and thousands in the church in Nigeria that will go to waste, that will not in some way be part of the story of the church in Nigeria, which is part of the story of the church throughout the ages, which is part of God's grand redemption story. They have that confidence. It's a change in perspective that makes all the difference in the world. But not only does God offer us a change in perspective, he offers us a change in our pursuits, what we're actually going for. God can bring a change in our heart that we don't care at all about door number one. We no longer are spending our time pursuing those things. That's not the change we're looking for. And Jay, that was your musical last night. The things we think that will bring us joy. God can change our hearts where we aren't chasing all of that. Where he gives us new pursuits that bring deep, true joy. Because when you choose to love another human being, you elevate your story and theirs. When you choose to love another human being, you make your story better. You make their story better. And you participate in God's story. And you find yourself doing his work. Last week in November, I was in the giant supermarket just down the street. And I've been waiting 3 weeks to tell you this story. Okay, now you're going to be disappointed because it's not going to be that good. I was in the lane that goes fast, express, whatever they call it there, yeah. I was in the express lane closest to the door, and I was just about finished, and I was vaguely aware that there was the lane 2 lanes over, that something was like taking longer, and there was a long line there, but I wasn't tuned in. I was taking care of my stuff. I was about ready to leave, and I heard this voice kind of lift above the din, you know, the low chatter or whatever it was going on, saying, does she not have enough money? Put it on my bill, put it on my bill. And I looked over, the voice was coming from a middle-aged man in a wheelchair, probably about 3 people back the line from the lady who was at the cash register who was checking out. And I wanted to stay and watch. I thought, well, that's not what needs to happen. And the cashier was trying to figure out just how best to accommodate this generous offer. But think about that for a moment. I don't know the story of the man in the wheelchair. I know he's in a wheelchair, and that's all the story I need to know at the moment. Certainly, he had every excuse to be miserable because of his story that hadn't turned out the way he would have written it. But he chose to love another human being, and he elevated his story, and he brought a change in her story. And he participated in living out God's story. You see, there was a choice there. It's a choice any one of us can make. in all different circumstances. And it doesn't depend upon what's happening currently in my story to be able to make that choice. Just a day or two later, been waiting to share this story too. Young lady, her family knows quite well, saw her post on Facebook. Something amazing happened to me today, and I just have to share it. And I'll tell you, it's a little thing. But in this young lady's life, it was a big thing. She said, I went to the laundromat to wash my big comforter, and a friend told me they take credit cards, so I didn't take any money with me. Then as I attempted to swipe my credit card, a woman tried telling me in Spanish I needed to purchase a special card, and the attendant wouldn't be there for another 2 hours. So I was trying to make out what she was saying as two others just stared at me. So I started to leave, and she pulled out the special card and said, I pay. And she put my comforter in the washing machine and swiped her special laundromat card. But when I returned with the money to give her after running to the ATM, she was gone. It was like an angel in disguise. I don't know that Spanish woman's story. I know a little bit of the story of the person who wrote this. I know it's got to be difficult living in a new culture and trying to get by when you don't speak the language that well. I can imagine just being dependent upon going to a laundromat has its own challenges. That woman made a choice to love another human being. She enriched her story. She made her story better in the process. She made a big difference in the story of another young woman who shared her story on Facebook and gave me permission to share it with you this morning. Who knows the lives that one act will touch. I didn't ask permission for this, but another comment from 2 weeks ago. Robin, may I tell about your friend? You're saying, which one now? I'll start it in and you stop me. I think it was Robin who told me about a friend of hers that every time something happens in the news, a big calamity, a shooting in Colorado or in San Bernardino, California, or some other place in the world, wherever there is some big expression of evil in this world, of brokenness in this world, Robin has this friend who determines that she will do some act of kindness, some act of love that she would not have otherwise done. Can you imagine if the Church of Jesus Christ would take that approach? That every time there's something in the world that makes us say, oh no, the world's falling apart. If instead of cowering in fear, if we would step up and we would say, God, show me something I can do today to counteract what was done there. And how many of it would it take making that choice to bring about change in the world? To set darkness on its heels. Build your kingdom here. Let the darkness fear. What do we mean by God's kingdom? We mean God's story. We mean acknowledging that God is the ruler of all, and there's something in terms of God's story that's bigger than any brokenness, it's bigger than any pain, it's bigger than any circumstance in your life. It's greater than any ruler. It's greater than any group of terrorists. Greater than anything that can happen to us. Some of you here this morning, I know some of your stories, but not all. Maybe in the past year, or maybe longer than that, you've experienced the loss of a life's partner. You know, the grief may never go away, but your part in God's story is not over. You can not only go on living, but you can change your story and the stories of others by your choices to live in pursuit of opportunities to love another human being. Maybe you're stuck in failure. Well, the memory of your failure may never go away, but your part in God's story is not over. Not only can you go on living, but you can change your story and the stories of others by pursuing opportunities to love another human being in Jesus' name. You may have experienced deep hurt in your life. The pain of that may never entirely go away, but your part in God's story is not over. You not only can go on living, but you can change your story and the stories of others in the process by choosing to love another human being in Jesus' name and pursuing those opportunities in your life. You may have experienced frightening medical prognoses in your life. And fear related to the future may never entirely go away, but your part in God's story is not over. And you not only can go on living, you can change your story and the stories of others by choosing to pursue opportunities to love another human being in Jesus' name. It may be painful past or present. It may be uncertain future for whatever reasons. You not only can go on living, you can change your story and the stories of others and participate in God's great story. Over 2,000 years ago, a light came into this world. His name was Jesus. With that light inside of you, you can live a better story. You can bring light and hope to someone else's story for the glory of Christ.